It's the Kyle Hyman Show on Redeemer Radio.
This is Kyle Hyman, and joining us to talk about her book, Annunciation, A Call to Faith in a Broken World, is Sally Reed. Thanks for being here, Sally.
Well, thanks for having me.
How would you describe your First Communion and maybe compare or contrast that with your daughter's First Communion?
Well, I'm a convert. So 10 years ago, I had rather a dramatic conversion. I was an atheist, and the March of that year, when I first made contact with a priest for some research I was doing, so in the March I was an atheist, and by the December of that year, I had become a fully flown Catholic. So my conversion was very dramatic, and my First Communion was absolutely wonderful, and I felt like I was running towards the Vatican to be let in. There were sort of no doubts. I was simply desperate to get there. And my little girl at that point she was only 4 when I was received into the church. So she had a flavor of that, and I would always tell her how excited I was and how important the Eucharist was, and we would always have big and deep discussions about the faith. And then when she was 9 years old, it was time for her First Communion, and I was tucking her up into bed the night before, and she suddenly said, gosh, I'm not sure I can do it. And I said, what? We live near Rome, and First Communion in Italy is a big deal. There are massive parties, and children are often given iPhones as presents. And my daughter said, well, I'm worried that I'm doing it for the party and the presents, and I'm not doing it because I believe in God. I don't know if God is there. I don't feel anything in prayer. And she said, I think on a different occasion, she had said to me, you run up the aisle towards communion, but I don't feel like that. Which was a huge shock. And then I write about this in the book at the beginning, but she did go on to have that First Communion because I explained to her that once we'd established that she did believe in God and she believed in the basic tenets, I said, all God is asking you for is just to open a door to him. He's not asking for anything special or clever from you, and he's not asking that you see angels or anything like that. He just wants you to say yes. And once that was put to her, then she felt more comfortable, and she received her First Communion, and I think really was very glad she'd done it. But from then on, her questions continued. She could always see the atheist side of the family, which is my English family, and her dad, her father is not a practicing Catholic. So she's always got two worlds in view, the sort of the devout Catholic and the non-practicing. So she's always been a questioner.
And so you've written this book actually to your daughter, which is really just beautiful, and you tell that story in there. But the book is called Annunciation. So maybe back up here a little bit and say, if I had never heard of the Annunciation, how would you, in your own words, explain that story?
Well, I would say it's the most important event really of the world because it spawned the most important events, that is, the birth of Christ and the cross and the resurrection. To me, it's a very intimate moment, and it's sort of awe-inspiring and in many ways terrifying. It could have been terrifying for Mary, and yet she's so steady. And so in the book, I describe it as a new collaboration between God and man, because if you look at the Annunciation in my favorite paintings of the Annunciation, the angel and Mary, they look very much like equals. Mary is the only non-divine person to whom angels can bow, right? So the angel is kind of bowing towards Mary and her head is kind of bent, but more like she's listening. So it's this beautiful moment where everything is decided, and it's, the history of the world can go either way. It's that tipping point that relies totally on her trust and on her submission to God's will.
And you talk about the image. You specifically have Fra Angelico's painting of the Annunciation on the cover of the book, and you refer to it a couple different times in the book. You also mentioned that it's hung on the wall of your daughter's room. So what is it about that specific image that you like?
I think it is the intimacy. It's also beautiful colors. I think that the cover of the book is really beautiful because there are several versions actually of that Annunciation, and they've picked a really lovely one because of the colors. But it's that fact that their heads are bent together almost like two lovers, and it's this very intimate conversation, and the angel in this picture seems to be saying, shh, like he's got a finger up, like, don't say anything, like this is like a secret, don't tell anyone. And indeed, she didn't tell anyone for a while. It wasn't like she rushed out into the street. She kept it to herself, and of course she had to tell Joseph and then Elizabeth. But yeah, I think it's just a beautiful, very private moment, which in our world today, when things become newsworthy so quickly and we rush to tell people things all the time and we're always publishing, I think the Annunciation is a really beautiful moment to remind ourselves that the very great things we don't need to publish in that way. We don't need to rush to tell. We should actually meditate on things.
So how has that had an impact on your faith?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what I really say to my daughter, because I look at the Annunciation through the book, obviously I take it into 5 lines from Luke and look at each chapter. And the Annunciation, to me, it just contains so much, because I think I've realized from my own experience and through listening to other people that the way that God comes to us, as the Archangel Gabriel came to Mary, can be so colorful. I mean, my own conversion was incredibly colorful. And yet, the flip side to that is that lots of people will say, well, I just don't get that. Nothing happens to me. And to me, receiving the Eucharist just doesn't, I don't feel that intense about it.
Sure.
And I think that I wrote this book. One of the things I wanted to address to my daughter was that that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
We're all the body of Christ, and Mary's experiences belong to her and my experiences belong to her. And whenever a great mystic has had an amazing experience of God, usually they'll say somewhere in there, like with Julian of Norwich or Teresa of Avila, they will say, these experiences are for all Christians, not just for me. And so I think that that's really important. I think that God treats us all in different ways at different times, and we never know what's going to happen, because you can't will God to do something in your life. God will appear to you as he wants to, and in the way that you are ready for. So that's one aspect.
Yeah. We're talking with Sally Reed. The book is called Annunciation, A Call to Faith in a Broken World. And why do you think the Annunciation is that call to faith for a broken world, as your subtitle suggests?
Yeah. Well, when the night before my daughter's first communion, when I said to her, all you need to do is open a door, I also said, all you need to do is say yes. And so really God was asking for her fiat. And I realized through my daughter growing up, and now she's much more sure in her faith, but when she would really rebel and not want to go to Mass, I realized that God was asking for her fiat, every Sunday. He was asking for her fiat every morning to go to school without arguing with me, and God asks for our fiat all the way through life. And that's especially applicable in cases of anxiety and when we're unsure and when things are very difficult. When it's hard to get out of bed in the morning, we have to think of it as a fiat. God is asking us to move on and to take the day that he's given us. So in a sense, that's why the Annunciation was important for this story to me, because I realized that that's what I was saying to my daughter. You need to say yes to God all the way through.
They say that if you try to market something to everybody, then it just becomes watered down and it's marketed to nobody, and that you should try to pick a particular audience. And with this book, you're not just writing to a specific audience, but you're actually writing to your daughter, not about your daughter and not generically to somebody like your daughter, but specifically writing this book to your daughter. Why did you want to write the book in that way?
Well, because when I started to write the book, it truly was that. I didn't think to myself, I'll get it published and be on the radio talking about it. I literally thought, I actually need to write this down. I wanted to write down the reasons for her, why she should not abandon the faith. And it was specifically for her, because I know her so well, and she's got a heart like mine. But at the same time, I think that the human heart is common to us all, right? So I wanted to write down, why, with all of her weaknesses and her desires and her passion, because she's very passionate, why, life is going to be terribly hard if she gives up the Catholic faith and if she gives up God. And so I started to write it just to her. And someone commented recently and said, gosh, but it's very thorough and it's so deep. And I said, yeah, because that's how she is. She's not going to be fobbed off. I mean, this is something for her to carry with her through her life. And then as I wrote it, I just realized more and more that it was also for me. I was thinking, this is kind of useful, And then I realized, actually, it could be for a lot of people. And originally, it was called Annunciation for my daughter. And it was Ignatius, the publisher, who said, well, let's not call it that, because it isn't just for daughters. It really is for everybody.
Yeah. It's just kind of amazing how you just base everything around the Annunciation, break it down in those different chapters on those different lines. Did you think about like the Annunciation just being one component of this and having other stories, or was it always just going to be the Annunciation is how I'm going to explain this to
No,
my
it was
daughter.
always going to be, it was always going to be just the Annunciation. And when people say, how did I decide to do that? I don't know how it's just one of those things that really comes to you all whole. It just came to me in one go. And it was like this movement of God coming to us, how he comes to us so close, we can touch him, which is when, Gabriel came to Mary. And then by the end of that scene with the angel, it says, and the angel departed from her, which has always seemed to me to be a very loaded and beautiful line and desolate in many ways. And so I could see how the Annunciation sort of encompassed everything. And I'm always a writer that looks at things on a small scale. I like to really look hard at one particular thing. And there's just so much in there. There's Behold, I am the handmaid of the Lord, which I took to meaning about identity and vocation, is be it done to me according to your word. Mm-hmm. And all of those things for my daughter and for her generation, they're so urgent because this generation is so obsessed with how they're seen and, which group they belong to and publishing stuff and being present, that I wanted to really tackle that and just remind her and remind hopefully other people that, however many followers you've got on Instagram is really beside the point.
You mentioned, Behold, I am the handmaid of the Lord. That is chapter 3. Can you explain the other 4 lines that you took from the Annunciation?
Yeah, so the first, as I talked about, is and he came to her. So that's the ways in which God comes to us or not, and how, we can be with Christ through Mary's own experience with the angel, through the Eucharist. Because, through the Annunciation, we now have the Eucharist. We can have God physically inside of us. And then the second chapter, do not be afraid. Great favorite of mine, as we're from a fairly anxious family, which is all about how God says to us, not just in that scene, but throughout the Bible and throughout a lot of private revelation, do not be afraid. So what does that mean when there is so much to be afraid of? And Mary had an awful lot to be afraid of. So it's about God helping us in our anxiety and healing us in our suffering and how the Mass can really help. Mm-hmm. And then, Behold, I am the handmaid of the Lord, is about this big question of who am I? And I direct it particularly at my daughter, but I think it's got ramifications for all of us about how we identify ourselves. I mean, my daughter is Anglo-Italian, so she's very Italian and she's very English. And I've seen her kind of move with that and struggle with that through the years and, laugh at her other identity and then get very defensive about that other identity and all that stuff. But how, at the end of the day, when you cut through it all, we're children of Christ. And what we're called to be more than anything is to be his mother or his brother or his sister and to actually console him and be there for him and to be his handmaid. And then the next chapter would be Let it be to me according to your word, which is quite meaty, but it's really about how I talk about, especially in relation to young people, how it's important to construct the city of God within ourselves, which means that, words are very, very important. So the words that we have living in our hearts and the words that spring to our lips most easily, those are the most important ones. So it's knowing Scripture and it's knowing the Psalms and knowing the Rosary and being able to call upon the name of our Lord Jesus Christ very easily in times of difficulty. And about the Jesus prayer, which I'm a big fan of the Jesus prayer, which is the Eastern prayer, which is very short and repetitive. So it's a lot about that and also about the sacraments, and it kind of goes on, but the sacraments and how they shape our lives and all of that. And then the last chapter, as I say, is And the angel departed from her, which is really about when we feel God's absence very powerfully, and about depression as well, which is when, as some people may know, if you're depressed, it's all very well people saying pray, but you're sometimes so depressed you can't even pray. So it's addressing those things and addressing the wounds that we have and how God heals our wounds.
All right. Well, such a great book, and you did such a great job breaking down these 5 different lines. Where can people get a copy of the book?
Ignatius.com, which is the site of Ignatius Press, or Amazon, or good Catholic bookshops.
All right. Again, it's called Annunciation, A Call to Faith in a Broken World by Sally Reed. And also, if you remember back to episode 96, we talked with Sally about her conversion. You can check out our book, Night's Bright Darkness, A Modern Conversion Story. It's also available. So thank you so much, Sally, for coming back on the show. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much.